Murder is an art, and as such, the privilege of committing it should be reserved for those few who are really superior individuals.
And the victims, inferior beings whose lives are unimportant anyway.
Obviously. You aren't planning to do away with a few inferiors by any chance?
Who knows? I'm a creature of whim.
Is it all over?
Brandon! A stupid display like that in front of somebody else will be just as good as a confession. Being weak is a mistake.
Because it's being human?
Because it's being ordinary.
There's something upsetting both of you a great deal.
I think we're going to get caught.
You've got to pull yourself together.
It's odd the way one can pyramid simple facts into wild fantasies, isn't it?
Good and evil, right and wrong were invented for the ordinary average man, the inferior man, because he needs them. This party will be the most exciting ever given. Oh, no.
I showed him something that I'd written one day, and Hitchcock just said, would you like to work on the next screenplay I'm going to do? It's based on Patrick Hamilton's play. It was a true story. And I got the play and I read it, and I thought, I'd love to do this. So I would sit and we would hack out the scenes that he wanted to shoot, and we would find bridges for the stuff he didn't want to shoot. Some elements in the film followed the play, some did not. But then he brought in Arthur Laurents to write the finished screenplay. And that was a general tendency he had. He would have a treatment written, and he worked very closely with whoever was designing that treatment. And we would sit day after day after day in his garden in Bel Air, and Hitch would produce a bottle of wine around noon. He was a great one for plying you with liquid refreshment. And then he'd hire someone to take that treatment and do generally the dialogue.
I've always thought it was out of character for David to drink anything as corrupt as whiskey.
Out of character for him to be murdered, too.
Yes, wasn't it? Good Americans usually die young on the battlefield, don't they? Well, the Davids of this world merely occupy space, which is why he was the perfect victim for the perfect murder.
Arthur is a very accomplished writer. He wrote the screenplay. I didn't. I just wrote the treatment. But at the time that that film was made, my name was perhaps somewhat better known than Arthur's was. Now Arthur Laurents has got a much bigger reputation than I've got, and he's earned it.
I had been working on the screenplay for The Snake Pit, which was getting a lot of attention in Hollywood. And I think that brought me to Hitch's attention. I think the real reason was he wanted a playwright, because this is essentially a play and done as a play. So he came to me. I liked the idea of working with him, and we got along very well. It was very easy, really. Rope really comes from an English play by Patrick Hamilton called Rope's End. And I thought it was going to be easier than it was to make it American. The trouble was when you translated the English dialogue, it became very homosexual, unintentionally. And also the class system. It's very different in England than here. So it called for more changes than I anticipated.
Don't.
Got to see if there's
I know. But not just yet. Let's stay this way for a minute.
What was curious to me was Rope is obviously about homosexuals. The word was never mentioned. Not by Hitch, not by anybody at Warner's where it was filmed. It was referred to as it. They were going to do a picture about it, and the actors were it.
You frightened me. You always have. From that very first day in prep school. Part of your charm, I suppose.
The picture was much more successful in Europe because I suppose in Europe they were used to it, and we weren't here. And they didn't deny, but they never discussed that it was based on the Loeb-Leopold case. They ignored it. I couldn't understand that. Two rich boys in a Chicago school decided to murder a third boy for the thrill of it. And I mentioned it, and everybody looked blank and went on with whatever we were talking about. But it obviously came from that. At that time, because of a thing called the Legion of Decency in the Catholic Church, they had a watchdog of censors. And you had to be careful. There were certain rules. If a man and a woman were on the same bed, one of them had to have his or her feet on the floor. A married couple could not sleep in the same bed. A woman couldn't ask a man for a divorce. The man had to say, I know you want a divorce. With rope, of course, you could never say that they were it. So there was no mention of it in the picture at all. And what happened with that picture was, it was produced by Sidney Bernstein. He was very English and a great friend of Hitch's and an admirer of Hitch's. And when I finished the screenplay, he said, now, my boy, you have to make every sentence a gem. I said, I'm going to New York. You can make it a gem. Because I had been in Hollywood a little too long to suit me. So I went back to New York. When I came back, he had taken some of the dialogue from the original play and put it back in this. And it was full of my dear boy. Well, every my dear boy was marked in big blue pencil. Homosexual, out, out, out. So it had to be cleaned up from all those English remarks, which had nothing to do with anything, really.
I wish we had him out of here. I wish it was somebody else.
It's a trifle late for that, don't you think? Whom would you have preferred? Kenneth?
Oh, I don't know. I suppose anyone was as good or as bad as any other. You, perhaps.
I had come out of the Navy, and the first film I did was Nick Ray's first film, They Live by Night. And right after that, I came to New York for the first time and fell madly in love with New York and with the theater. And I was supposed to be here for 2 weeks, and I stayed for 6 or something. And finally, the studio was screaming at me, Sam Goldwyn, get back to Hollywood. So I did, and lo and behold, I was going to go see Mr. Hitchcock, because I had to go to the studio and pick up the script of Rope. I had no idea what it was.
You're not really frightened anymore, are you, Philip? You can't have fear, you know. Neither of us can. That's the difference between us and the ordinary man, Philip. They talk about committing the perfect crime, but nobody does it. Nobody commits a murder just for the experiment of committing it. Nobody except us.
John Dole had quite a success in the movie The Corner's Green. He was very good in it. And I thought he was quite good in this.
That bears a curious resemblance to champagne.
It is.
It's very good champagne, too. What's the occasion?
Well, I told you on the phone. It began as a little party for Mr. Gentley so he could look over those first editions. Then it turned out Philip and I were going up to the country tonight.
You told me that, too, Brennan.
Did I?
Yeah.
Well, I thought I'd make it sort of a farewell for Philip.
The starting of John Dole was in the script, and he did it wonderfully. And the only reason I thought of it was it shows his nervousness, this apparently cool character. Something to make the audience say, oh, he's going to break, I hope.
You always did stutter when you were excited.
Well, I guess I'm always excited when I give a party.
Really?
In Rope, you have a teacher who is also supposed to be homosexual. I smile because Hitch wanted Cary Grant for that part, Montgomery Clift, for one of the boys. And according to what he told me, they both turned it down because they didn't want to be identified with it. But the intention was that this teacher had influenced these boys with Nietzsche's philosophy of the Superman. And he also had an affair with one of them.
Now, you don't really approve of murder, Rupert, if I may.
You may, and I do. Think of the problems it would solve. Unemployment, poverty, standing in line for theater tickets.
Well, Jimmy Stewart never had an affair with anyone. He was just a Boy Scout. So the picture was curiously off focus and didn't have the sexual center that it should have. He was very good as a detective, but he had no relation to those boys at all.
Something gone wrong, Brandon?
No, Janet just has a talent for being bothersome at times. However, I suppose I'd better... What did you mean, something gone wrong?
Jimmy Stewart just grumped around a lot and was kind of friendly with the maid, which was another interesting thing about that picture. The woman who played the maid, when they sat around while the lights were being set up, She was ignored by the rest of the cast. They treated her like a maid, get me a glass of water. Poor woman.
Mrs. Wilson, please serve the guests. Don't lecture them.
We did get up on the wrong side of the bed, didn't we?
This party will be the most exciting ever given.
With these people?
They're a dull crew, all right. The Kentleys couldn't be duller if they tried. But we did have to have them. After all, they are David's mother and father.
I don't know about what he wanted. I just know that perhaps because I came from the theater, every character is important. And I guess in movies, they weren't used to that anyway. Rope doesn't have a very large cast, and I thought it was really important that every character be a character.
Oh, Mr. Kentley, so glad you could come.
Thank you, Brandon. Mrs. Kentley isn't well, so I took the liberty of bringing my sister-in-law, Mrs. Atwater. She's been staying with us.
Oh, delighted to have you, Mrs. Atwater.
Delighted to come, dear boy.
What was curious to me was Rope is supposedly American and has 2 English in it. And I think a brilliant performance in the picture is given by Cedric Hardwicke, who's English.
Constance Collier, she was a marvelous, marvelous actress. And she had a lady with her secretary, which I called her nanny, named Phyllis. And she'd be always calling Phyllis, Phyllis, Phyllis. She'd be yelling all the time. So we all started yelling, Phyllis, Phyllis. But she and Sir Cedric were really the peppy ones on the set. They had a great time together. They just laughed and carried on and, enjoyed themselves.
I think I like Mason as much as Errol Flynn.
I'll take Cary Grant myself.
Oh, so will I. Capricorn, the goat, he leaps divine. So much,
Yes.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, he was thrilling in that new thing with Bergman. What is it called now? The something of the something. No, that was the other one. This was just plain something.
I really don't remember whether she was referring to Notorious or anything with that dialogue about going to the movies. I just wanted that character to be vague and not be able to remember much of anything.
I must say I've had a perfectly dreadful time getting tickets for that new musical. What's it called? You know.
The something with what's her name?
Actually, Constance Collier had written a play with Ivan Novello, who was a very close friend of my parents, which my father then made into a movie called Downhill, which was a big flop.
How's Mrs. Kentley?
As usual, it's a cold this time. I hope David arrives soon. She wants him to call her.
David's her only child, Mr. Kentley.
Well, he's my only child, too, but I'm willing to let him grow up.
I try to put things in like with the mother of the dead boy, not have her, but have him be a mother's boy.
She's frantic.
I better talk to her.
She hung up. She began to cry so badly. Oh, Henry, I'm worried.
We were spared seeing her because that gets really tiresome. I try to make a character for this dead boy whom you supposedly never saw. Of course, Hitch crossed me up because he shot the scene of the actual murder and inserted it into the picture. I think he did it because he had a failure of nerve. I thought the suspense would be, is there or is there not a body in that chest? Well, here he eliminated that. Once you see it, you know they're murderers and you know they're going to get caught. And I think it took a lot of the tension out of the picture. At least it did for me.
My father had always wanted to photograph a stage play, but he was never quite sure whether it would be a success or not, so he never did it until he started his own company, Transatlantic Pictures, with Sidney Bernstein, who he had done pictures for the Free French during the war. When my father decided he wanted to make Rope, he would only do it in the way as one continuous thing, which is the way you would watch a stage play.
Right from the beginning, he told me he was going to do it as a play, and with, I think, 9 takes for 9 reels, something like that. And that interested him because it hadn't been done. It seemed to me to be a gimmick, but who was I? He was the great Hitchcock. And when you see the film, what bothers me is he has to close in on someone's back, reload the camera, and then pull back again from the back. So you see really what he's trying to hide.
The attraction to me, of course, was Alfred Hitchcock and the way it was going to be shot, because it was going to be shot a reel at a time. And it was supposed to be a film that had no editing. which of course he couldn't really do because there's only 10 minutes in the reel of film that is used. So we had to shoot 10 minutes at a time, and he wanted this sort of flow to go on. And it was just a very sort of interesting experiment to do.
Oh, they're here. Are we ready?
As ready as we'll ever be.
Well, now, mind you, don't you be so busy at that piano that you don't eat anything, getting too thin. And don't you let them gobble up all that patty before you have any. Let's hope it's a success. Oh, my tray.
Take it in the kitchen, Mrs. Wilson. I'll answer the door.
There wouldn't be this last-minute hustle-bustle if you kept my table and let those roll.
Now the fun begins.
Hitch loved to show everybody the set, and we had practically everybody in Hollywood visiting, and Hitch loved showing it off.
What was impressive about the set was how difficult it all was to shoot anything. You didn't get any idea that this was a startlingly attractive set or unattractive set, but it was like seeing this giant erector set that this kid was moving around and getting his jollies from. It was amazing, the timing. The stagehands were terribly important in that picture.
It was all laid out ahead of time, which he always did with all the drawings. And it was difficult because the walls were on rollers and the furniture had to move all the time. And we would rehearse for a day and then shoot the next day. And many times the lighting didn't work right, so we'd have to reshoot. And it was hard on the actors.
He was famous for calling actors, I don't know, sheep or something. And I remember he had a press conference on the set of Rope. And he was a star, which most directors weren't. He was the star of his pictures. So the press from all over the world was there, and he was expounding on how much he rehearsed. And Jimmy Stewart said, the only damn thing that's been rehearsed around here is the camera, which was true. He had a curious way of directing. He would say, smile, and then you had to stop smiling. That was directing actors. But he got what he wanted.
You going to play? How lovely.
Your wife sends her love.
David wasn't there?
No, he'll probably be here in a minute, though.
It was a Poulenc piece, and I had to learn it as best I could. It was recorded, of course, but I had to really sort of do the fingering.
I knew the music, and it also had a strange quality I thought was right for the picture. He practiced it like mad, Farley. Couldn't really play it, but at least the fingers looked right. I'm always intrigued with that on the screen. You see them playing up a storm, and you begin to believe it.
You're very fond of that little tune, aren't you? You know, Philip, I wish I could come straight out with what I want to know. Unfortunately, I don't know anything. I merely suspect.
He was, he was Jimmy Stewart, and I had a feeling he was a bit unsure about the part, because in a sense, he is as much a heavy as the boys are, because he was their teacher, and he never really played that kind of part before. So I don't know how he felt. I think he felt a bit uncomfortable, really. Someone like James Mason would be more acceptable, really, than Stewart. I think that's maybe one of the reasons that it wasn't such a big hit. They didn't like Stewart in that kind of part.
It was very hard for the actors to play, for example, an intimate scene with their feet crossing over each other as they climbed over cables to accommodate the camera. Everything was to accommodate the camera. And Hitch was terribly nervous about it. It was very hard to do. It was a gigantic trick, and that's what interested him.
The color cameras were enormous. It was like this great big thing moving around this room, and we all had to get out of its way. Chairs were being pulled out and everything, or pulled under you, so you could sit down and hope that the chair would be there.
There, that's much better.
You saw through the window the skyline, and it had to get darker as the party progressed. And this was Hitch's first picture in blazing Technicolor. The set was very subdued, and the costumes were all very quieted. He was careful about that. And you saw it on the screen. It was like a Mexican fiesta in Olivera Street. Because the printing process was quite primitive then. And that was the first time I ever saw him get really angry. And they had to reshoot and reprint. It was awful.
The crews loved him because he knew everything technically. Years and years and years before, when he was very young, he worked in Munich, in Ufa, the German studios, and he was a set designer then, and he did all kinds of jobs. So he knew what lenses should be on the camera and where everything should be and the lights and everything. And the crews loved him because he knew. And not many directors did, may I say, not many at all.
Hitchcock is in every one of his pictures. Very important cameo because everybody's looking for him. And the question was, how was he going to get himself into a picture that takes place in one room? So the original idea, which was his, he was going to have a neon drawing of his profile on a sign outside the room, which he did, and then I suppose he decided it was too obvious or too jokey. So under the titles, you see him walking along the street where the boys have their apartment.
What the devil are you doing?
Making our work of art a masterpiece.
Brandon, you're going too far.
Why? What do you mean? I just thought it'd be nice to have supper in here. On this.
He was interested in adding ghoulish touches of what he hoped would be. For example, he wanted a bottle of wine to get knocked over on this buffet table they'd made of the chest with the dead body in it. So I said, but it's a red herring, because, they strangled him. There wouldn't be any blood. And he was pissed off for a minute, but he didn't do it.
What is it? I feel pretty honored.
Oh, why?
Well, looks like a pretty small farewell party.
Oh, well, we're really killing two birds with one stone. The party's also for Mr. Kentley.
I tried to do verbally what Hitch wanted to do visually, which is to inject words or word pictures that would make the audience aware of a double meaning to almost everything that was going on. As talking about those hands of yours to the pianist, but she really means a strangler, or doesn't know she means it, but we know that's what it means.
These hands will bring you great fame.
I tried to lighten up the whole thing, give it humor.
You know, when I was a girl, I used to read quite a bit.
Oh, we all do strange things in our childhood.
Hitch was very witty. He could be outrageous, but he liked humor a lot. He enjoyed it tremendously. There's always humor in his movies. Somewhere along the line, there's something that happens.
I hope you knock him dead.
He was a punster. He would say, don't come pig's tail. That means twirly. That means too early. By the time you figured that out, you were late. He would say, Ford after Ford. This is a long one. It gets down to Tin Lizzie, and then tin after tin, and then it's 10 after 10. But it amused him.
I've always wished for more artistic talent. Well, murder can be an art, too. The power to kill can be just as satisfying as the power to create.
He's the only director I know of who knew absolutely everything that was going to be on the screen. He didn't have to look through a viewfinder. He knew. This was probably the most difficult picture in that regard, because was the wall going to be moved to the right spot? Would the camera be in the right spot? The others, once it was set up, he didn't even bother to look. He knew. And he was great at telling a story through the camera, as that sequence with taking the food off the chest. The idea of eating off a coffin, which is what they were doing, that's funny and ghoulish and macabre, and it was a wonderful idea. But he takes it up a step higher, because as the food is removed from the top of the chest, which is a coffin, you suddenly think, what's going to happen when the maid takes off the last food, the tablecloth, and has to open the bloody chest to put the books back in? And that he does beautifully and so quietly. You don't realize you're in danger till suddenly you, the audience, are. You think, oh my God, we're going to see. Again, from my viewpoint, having seen in the beginning, it was no surprise. But I think it would have been even more of a surprise if, oh yes, let's open it, let's find out. But we knew already.
That's all right, Mrs. Wilson. You can put the books back when you come in to clean in the morning.
suppose.
I'll get your hat,
Certainly.
Mr. Cadell.
Mrs. Atwater, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for letting me come. I'm so sorry we have to leave. Goodbye.
Good night.
Goodbye.
Thanks once more.
That's not yours.
I'm very sorry we had to spoil it.
You couldn't possibly spoil it, Mr. Kentley.
That is filmed so brilliantly. You think they're going to get away with it. And then comes that hat thing, and it's done wonderfully. He was just brilliant at that. It's a twist because it's entirely believable. It isn't a fake thing. People do that. They put on the wrong hat.
Good night, Mr. Cadell.
Oh, you going too? Yes. Yes, I must. Good night. Good night.
Brandon, it's Rupert.
What?
He wants to come up. He says he left a cigarette case here. He wants to come up.
Well, let him come.
Stewart was in part responsible for the murder. He had taught these boys that philosophy. He's trying to find an excuse for himself, and he can't really. So what it comes down to is the detective explaining, you left the glove at the scene and there was a drop of blood and that sort of thing. Otherwise, it was straightforward acting. It works.
Suppose you or I, how would you get David out of the way?
Now, you're much better at this sort of thing than I am.
No, but what would you do if you were I?
I wanted to have more fun between the two fellows, and there wasn't room for it, let's put it that way. I didn't want to show them obsessed with murder and all that. After all, if they wanted to do murder for kicks, they must get some pleasure out of it, but let's see the pleasure. I suppose they were afraid if you showed the pleasure, you would hate them. I don't know, I thought it would make them more interesting, but anyway, it's not in.
There's something upsetting both of you a great deal, something that,
Excuse me, sir.
They had dailies, except here you saw a reel. And finally the whole thing was put together. It was easier to put together than most pictures because they didn't have to do any cutting. It was already cut.
He knew just where he was going to cut, why he was going to cut, and in the case of Rope, why he was not going to cut. Instead of it being a film is put together, cut, piece. I don't know how many pieces went into Rope, but I swear that it seemed like not more than a dozen.
I do want to. I just think we ought to wait till after you graduate.
I don't.
It's only a month.
Janet, a month.
Please.
Sorry. I personally consider us engaged as of now. Congratulations.
David, no.
Look, you can say yes in a taxi. I have a 2:30 appointment.
I'm
and you're...
staying right here.
Oh, afraid you'll say yes?
I'll see you tonight at Brandon's party.
To promote the movie, they had a really unusual trailer. They had the victim, David, with his girlfriend, and he turns and says to her, well, I'll see you later. And then a voice comes over and says, but he never did see her later, and she never saw him. So it was a good trailer.
that's the last time she ever saw him alive. And that's the last time you'll ever see him alive.
My feeling is it simply didn't make much of a stir one way or the other. The culture at that time was trying to deny that homosexuality even existed. And here they had well-known Hollywood players involved in it. So they didn't want to see what was there. So the best thing, well, let's not talk about this picture about it. I think that was sort of the general reaction.
We would have lunch together sometimes, and I didn't really get to know him that well then. It wasn't until Strangers on a Train where we really became good friends. My experiences with Hitchcock were very meaningful to me, and I learned a lot from him, and I respect him, and I think that he was one of the all-time great directors of Hollywood.
The thing to me that is best about the picture is not the technical side. That may be called ahead of its time, but it was never used again. The technical side of Rope doesn't interest me or disinterest me. What is extraordinary about it is its treatment of homosexuality. I mean, today, it still is one of the most sophisticated movies ever made on that subject. Probably treats them more as people than anybody else has. Hitchcock certainly knew that, and it certainly attracted him. And what he liked was not that they were homosexual, but they were homosexual murderers. If they were just murderers, he wouldn't have been interested. If they were just homosexual, he wouldn't be interested. You had to have another little twist to it, and that he liked. And he loved the idea of the party, of celebrating a murder with food on the coffin, which is a great idea.
We all worked very hard, and it was fun, too. We knew we were doing something different that we probably would never, ever do again, which we never have.
I'm flattered to be thought of as a professional colleague of Hitchcock's, but I guess I was. It was an uneven partnership in which he was the major contributor, and we maintained a relationship right up until the day he died.
When I first saw the movie, I really liked it. I thought it was a good movie. I liked the humor that they were able to bring in it. I think the movie is important today because it's so different. Not only is it different from anything my father did, but it's different from anything that was going on in those days. And I think the things that you remember about that movie is the setting sun outside the window of the apartment, and things like that that you're not conscious of while you're watching the movie. But if you go back and see it a second time, it's really exciting.
Go ahead and look. I hope you like what you see.
He's got it.